let me add a little bit to that. I actually know Federico for a long time. I don't know if you remember, a long time. He was a professor at UCLA when I was a student. And there's people that you know and you're impressed by their intellectual capacity, and that would be Federico. But then you're inspired by their public service, and that is Federico. We do have a lot to cover. But before we go into that, we have a full house. And there's this story that I've heard that I think may help us set a little bit the tone about some deregulation of the watermelon in Argentina. Can we start with that story?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming and spending this time with us today. Thank Ilan, Eric, and Laura for the invitation. The watermelons. So sometimes you don't know where to look. You don't know even what is there. So 70,000, as Ilan said, 70,000 decrease. I have very bad news. It's actually, afterwards, we discovered that 70,000 were the ones that were digitalized. Actually, the actual number is 700,000. Okay, so we're working on that. So we need everybody to help us identify where the problems is. So I opened up my email so people could write to me. Then we set up a website a little bit more structured to get suggestions. We've gotten like 12,000 suggestions. But a guy writes to me and says, Federico, can you help me with the watermelons? With my watermelons. I said, well, what's your problem with the watermelons? Says, they don't taste good. No, they taste great. In fact, I export my watermelons to many countries. But the problem I have with the watermelons is there's a regulation which forces me to package the watermelons in a specific way. And my problem is that that way is not the way that my client abroad wants. It's a different package. So I go to the Food and Drug Administration and say, look, I want to package my watermelons in the way my client is willing to buy them. You know, we're not talking about plutonium here, okay? We're not talking about Chernobyl residues or anything like that. It's just a watermelon, okay? So it's not very dangerous to my knowledge. And I've been for 10 years going around, and I've never been able to convince the authorities to allow me to package the watermelons like my clients want them. So, okay, so I've given up. I tell you what I do. I package the watermelons like the Argentinian authority tells me. And when the boat leaves, I send another boat with 60 guys. They get on the boat, they unpack the watermelons, and they pack them the way I can sell them, okay? So this is what I need help with, okay? And I went to my team and I said, you know, this guy has to be telling the truth. Because if I want to imagine this story, I cannot imagine it, okay? So this can't, I mean, it's unimaginable, so it has to be true. So I actually get into the website, I put Senasa packaging, and boy, I realized this guy was telling me about the iceberg that only shows 10%, and then there's a big thing beneath where he was just only identifying the 10%, which was voice. So I get a resolution from 1982, which was there, 180 pages, and I start reading anana, A, the first A. So how you have to package the anana, and then berries, and then cerezas, and then whatever, okay? By the time I was by a few letters down the road, my brain had exploded, okay? So I said, this is amazing. I mean, the state is telling me how I should package, okay? So we actually got rid of that, and it was interesting because I told the people in my team, why don't you print me all the regulation which has to do with fruit producing, okay? And they printed, and the pile kept getting taller and taller. So we ended up with 1 kilo, 500 grams of regulation, okay? So I said, there's a big pile of paper. And I said, okay, you need to get a PhD in literature, before being a fruit producer, so you can read all this and understand all this shit, okay? And so I went to the Food and Drug Administration and said, what should the state do regarding fruit production? And then the guy says, 2 things. Oh, 2 things, only 2 things. I had a big pile in the back of my office. He says, you need to have some control of who's producing a fruit, because if you have a pest, you have something, a sanitary emergency, you need to know who to work with. And then we need to do the certificates when you export fruit, because you don't want to send fruit abroad which has any kind of pest. Is that the right word, pest? It's kind of has something that then they may close the whole market, correct? And that's the only two things. Yeah, that's the only two things. Okay, so perfect. So I wrote a regulation which had only those two things. We threw to the garbage. We eliminated the rest, and we moved from 1 kilo 500 to 80 grams of regulation. Okay, so that's my story with the watermelons.
Regulation. Now the regulation weighs less than a watermelon.
Yeah, exactly.
So, again, with this story, let's go now to all the great work that you have done. Let me just set the stage with some broad questions. Yeah. So first, your ministry is called the Ministry of Deregulation and State Reform. Why did you choose that name? Are they related? Are they different? Again, just tell us a little bit about the choice of the name. Then walk us through your thought process, criteria, methodology to identifying which are the sectors, which are the regulations that you need to eliminate, how do you come up with priorities, and then perhaps also more interesting, how do you manage the political economy of doing all of this?
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to stand up a little bit because it's going to take me a while. I mean, the name is interesting because when we started discussing the name with the president, there was an option like Minister of Simplification or Minister of Modernization. And we said it's not about simplifying because you want to ask yourself the question of whether what you're trying to simplify should be there or not, which is what Ilan already mentioned. And we definitely didn't want to call it the Ministry of Modernization because we don't think that the state modernizes everything, okay? We think that the state pushes you backward, so it would be the backwardation minister, and we thought that was not a good name, okay, to put. So it's basically deregulation and state reform, and the reason for the name is that I would say that on the economic front, Javier Milei has two main ideas. Of course, he has another agenda which has to do with security issues, etc., and property rights. But on the economics, if you understand these two ideas, you understand what the presidency of Javier Milei is about. And the first one is that Argentina is going to have a fiscal surplus, period. Not a primary surplus, it's going to have a fiscal surplus. The diagnosis is that a lot of the things that were wrong in Argentina were the result of this persistent fiscal deficit, and that's the transformation part. The transformation part has to do with helping the people in the finance ministry. In fact, we have here Carlos Gurman, which is one of the main architects of this fiscal surplus, in basically kind of reforming the state. I'll talk a little bit about it in a second. And the second idea is economic freedom. And economic freedom has to deal with deregulation. So those are the two main themes which we deal with. So let me talk a little bit about transformation first, and then I'll move to deregulation. So I said Argentina wants to have a surplus. Actually, it's having a surplus, and I would say with a twist, because there are two ways you can have a fiscal balance. You can have a fiscal balance reducing expenditure or increasing taxes. Well, the president is adamant, is very strong, that in Argentina the fiscal surplus is to be attained by reducing government expenditure, okay? And he achieved that fiscal surplus in 1 month. In the first year, Argentina has reduced government spending by 30%. And I think this is an amazing feat, which I think a lot of people didn't think was possible. And I think it's interesting to look at this experience because I think it reframes the discussion of fiscal policy on 3 dimensions. The first one, about what can be done and in what time you can do it. For example, I talked to presidential candidates, say, to give an example in Colombia, and they say, we have a deficit of 4%. Maybe I can reduce 1% per year. And then at the end of my term, I will have fiscal balance. I say, 1% per year. Why don't you do 5% in 1 month? And they say, no, but that's impossible. Well, Javier Milei did it. So I think it's maybe you're just not thinking out of the box or sufficiently, you're not being aggressive enough, you're not being creative enough. A lot of things that we thought were untouchable, President Milei said we're going to stop doing this, and we stopped doing this and nothing happened. Okay, so I think this idea of the frame of what can be done in what time and in what size, I think has been somehow challenged by this experience. The second thing in which I think this challenges is that Javier did this 30% reduction in government expenditure was a reduction of 5% of GDP in government expenditure. And there's a little bit of like mantra, like something which is we take as a God-given truth, which is that if you do a fiscal adjustment of 5% of GDP, you're going to have a recession. And we didn't believe that that was going to be the case, because if you actually have government expenditure, which is financed with taxes, when you reduce government expenditure, you reduce the taxes that you charge people. So you may have a negative effect from the reduction in terms of activity of the spending of the government, but you have a positive effect because the private sector is going to spend more because the taxes have been reduced. So there's no reason why you should have an output effect, neither of an increase in government expenditure nor a decrease of government expenditure. And in fact, if you look at what happened during the first year of Milei's presidency, output increased by 6% December to December during the first year, at a moment when he did a fiscal adjustment of 5% of GDP. Okay, so I think this idea of thinking that a fiscal adjustment is necessarily going to generate a recession, I think also has to be rephrased and has to be put under a question mark. And the third one, which I think is perhaps the most important or the most interesting, is the idea also, perhaps we took this as granted, if you're going to do a fiscal adjustment of 5% of GDP, it was going to be unpopular. Well, far from being unpopular, it's actually very popular. Because the problem is, what are you cutting and what are you doing with the spending that you're not doing anymore? You're going to reduce taxes. So if you cut the fat, if you cut the corruption, which Argentines for many years were tired of actually financing with their taxes, a lot of public expenditure was not delivering anything in terms of public goods for them. If you cut that, people say, finally, someone here has been able to take el toro por las astas, I don't know what the expression is in English, and has been able to do this, okay? The bull by the horns, the bull by the horns. Okay, so someone has taken the bull by the horns. And imagine this. When he reduces government expenditure by 5%, he reduces taxes by around 5%, which is the most important tax that Milei reduced, the inflation tax. And the inflation tax is a tax on the poor. So you're actually reducing government expenditure, reducing the money that was being received by the political establishment, and you use that to reduce the tax on the poor. The poverty rate falls 20%, and you take 10 million people out of the poverty rate in the first 18 months or year and a half of government of Javier Milei. So that's tremendously popular. Okay, so the idea that a fiscal adjustment is unpopular, I also think has to be seriously, very strongly challenged, and I think those are kind of very interesting conclusions from this experience. Okay, so that happened the first year. Now we call that, you know, the metaphor for us of this is the chainsaw. Okay, you've seen the chainsaw, and so now we move from chainsaw 1.0 to chainsaw 2.0. So what is the chainsaw 2.0? The chainsaw is the following: that last year was kind of a big cut, no? So now you want to go in the specifics. So what we decided to spend is one cabinet meeting discussing what a libertarian government should and should not do. So we made a list of the things that the government should do and a list of things that the government should not do. For example, if there's something that should be competency of a province or a city government, then the national government should not be doing it. If it's something that the private sector can do, then we should not be doing, etc., etc., etc. And now we're basically going around the government. I have my chainsaw guys, okay, and they go around the government and says, what do you do? And you see if they're in the yes or in the no's. And basically we are in the process of rationalizing the state. Let me just show you a graph. So you see, let me just show you this. This is a graph of the number of public employees. I have only 2 slides, Laura, so you don't need to go. But this is the number of employees that we have been laying off over this period, 42,000. Out of this would be from a basis of 300,000. But you can see that this is not stopping. In fact, it's actually accelerating. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Okay, so I think that's a little bit the agenda of the transformation part, Laura, of this thing. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the deregulation part, and which is that we interpret that as economic freedom. And the question is, why do you have all this regulation? Which are the origins of all this regulation? Okay, and I think you have I would say perhaps three origins. One is ideology. For a long period of time, we basically thought that the government should regulate things. You ask yourself why, but I don't see a clear view. But sometimes the regulation is a disguise. People who want to have government expenditure because they benefit from it. Okay, the best way to having government expenditure is to say, oh, the government should regulate this or should regulate that. So you have to create an agency, you have to create jobs, etc., etc. Okay, so the ideology is a disguise for government expenditure. Okay, and one thing that I also think is interesting in this group, I think is interesting to mention, is that sometimes you say we have to regulate because there's a market failure, there's an asymmetric information, moral hazard, you name it. Okay. But remember, the paper who started the literature on asymmetric information is a paper by George Akerlof called The Market for Lemons. The lemons, is used cars. Okay, remember the story. The story is in a used car market, the people who buys the cars has less information than the people who sell in the car. And then you say, oh, well, why is this person selling the car? So that must be of low quality. And if it's of low quality, I'm willing to pay less for the car. But if I'm willing to pay less for the car, then the good cars don't go into the market, and then you kind of unravel the market, and the market disappears because of this asymmetric information. Okay? And then, so in a lot of areas, the people say, oh, there's asymmetric information, we have to regulate. And I think also that is exaggerated. Why? Because if you look at the used car markets in the US, the used car market was the market that motivated the paper, okay, with which George Akerlof won the Nobel Prize in Economics by introducing asymmetric information. But the used car market in the US is not regulated. So what I'm trying to say is the fact that you have a market failure is not a blank check to justify regulation. You have to argue that the regulation is going to do more, it's going to better relative to the market outcome with the market failure. So I think this is something that is interesting to think about. Then, of course, I think laziness also, because have these geological things, there's a problem, and they say, oh, this was this accident, so we need to regulate this. And then the accident passes, the regulation stays, okay? And then something else happens 2 years down the road, another regulation, and then you have these layers, and no one goes and cleans kind of the things that were accumulating. So, for example, the fruit, I don't think there was anybody particular, I don't think there were packaging companies lobbying for that fruit packaging regulation. I think it was there, it just stayed there, and kind of nobody cared, and it just stayed over decades. But certainly the most important reason, I'm going to focus on this, going to your question about the political sustainability, is that most of the regulation is created by interest. There's an interest behind that. There's a reason for the regulation, is that someone has lobbied for the regulation, and that regulation benefits someone, okay? And I would say that there are two main, you have economic interest. It may be a union, it may be a business or an industrial sector or whatever. So that's kind of one dimension. And the other is the bureaucracy itself. The bureaucracy has an interest in the regulation itself, because the regulation is kind of the bread and butter of the regulator and the bureaucracy. So I think those also is an interest. I'm going to see, okay. So if you go to an agenda where you're going to ask yourself if this thing should be there, that you tend to think that having a market failure is not necessarily a reason in itself for having a regulation. You're going to be very careful where you regulate. You're going to deregulate a lot of things, most of the things. So how do you deal with the interests that were benefiting from that regulation? So I want to focus that on the business and the bureaucracy, okay? Well, on the business, I run with a big advantage, which is the president and his cell phone. Because the president on his cell phone has something called X, okay? So he can use that, okay? So I'll give you an example. We're going to deregulate. I say I gave in a lunch, I'm going to deregulate this, okay? And I may say the company which was behind this regulation. It's on the newspapers, correct? It kind of makes the news. The president immediately tweets the news stating his position that he supports this deregulation, okay? So the company which could fight that deregulation says, what am I going to do? The president has already stated his position on this. For those of you who are Argentine, it's like tiramos el ancho de espada, okay? With Javier, tiro el ancho de espada, okay? So it's, I mean, the president has already stated that he's in favor of this deregulation. So the lobby gets blocked. And the lobby doesn't do anything because they know who are they going to go. You go up to the president has already said. So I tell the president, because the president has a tremendous and amazing style because he's tremendously supportive of his ministers and he gives a lot of freedom to work and it's amazing and supports what we do. And I say, maybe Javier, you're doing this because you like the ideas, you share the ideas, but you don't understand how, or maybe you're not aware of how important it is that you do this. Because it's like you're walking ahead of me and you're clearing my path. And that allows me to move basically without any resistance, but not because there's not resistance, it's because the president himself has stated his position, has supported this, and that clears my path, okay? So I think that's amazing, that's amazingly important, and perhaps the conclusion, to make a more general conclusion is, well, you need the political endorsement to do the reforms. Now, if you have the political endorsement, which of course is backed by the popular vote that voted that person being there, then the reforms can actually take place. The bureaucrats...
Para los burócratas es un tanto más diferente, porque yo diría que quizá esta es la parte más difícil, porque los burócratas, la mente de los burócratas, la forma de pensar de ellos es, bueno, yo voy a pensar en todos los posibles riesgos que podrían ocurrir en esta situación. Hagamos una regulación para esto, por este riesgo, este otro riesgo, este otro riesgo y este otro. Y los riesgos están sobre la mesa, pero el costo de aquellas cosas que hay que hacer para evitar el riesgo no están en la mesa. Yo tengo un ejemplo que cruzar la calle es peligroso. Pero esa no es razón para prohibir a la gente.
Would be kind of ridiculous. There's a great story here from the great Elon. I don't know how much he's liked in this audience or not, but I'm a great fan. And he said in his biography, he's discussing his, you know, these things that he shoots on the air, okay, the spacecraft, okay. And then there's a meeting, and then an engineer in the board says, well, we need to do this test. And then Elon says, oh, this test. Could you please inform me who's the engineer who has suggested this test so I can proceed to his firing, okay? And then everybody's scared and says, no, the problem is NASA is asking us, and NASA's footing the bill, okay? They're asking for this test. Oh, says Elon, now I understand why these guys, the spaceships cost $2 billion when they could cost 200 million. Because, you know, NASA has this saying which says failure is not an option. But failure is not an option. It's too risky. It's not a cost-benefit efficient way of thinking about things, okay? So if you want to have the contingency of the contingency, the spacecraft is going to weigh 10 times more. It's going to take you 10 more years to build and 10 times the budget, okay? And it's not gonna fly. So kind of, it's not a good way to proceed. So my task with the bureaucrats is to convince them to, let's check if the risk is there. Because maybe we think there's a risk, and we want to kill an activity because we want to reduce the risk. We have to be able to explore the possibility, see if the risk is there, and then be attentive. And if we need to change and we need to reintroduce something, we can do it, but not kind of overkill because of excess of prudence, which may be unwarranted, okay? Now, Laura, you asked me about the method, so I want to talk about the method a little bit, about what is that we have to deregulate. And I think this is interesting for this audience, and with that I'm starting to close. We started working 2 years before Milei became president. And basically, Argentina is a status quo society. It's a society where it has built through its legal architecture the protection of a lot of interest. So if you're going to really generate a free society, you have to undo this legal architecture, which has been built over the years, and the purpose of which is to protect certain interests. So we decided that we're going to do it in a way no one had ever done, which is that we were going to review all the laws of Argentina, all the laws we're going to do. And we're going to classify them in laws that are okay, laws that have to be repealed, or laws that have to be changed, okay? And we worked a year and a half, and by the end of the year of the half, we had finished the job. That is, that we had seen all the laws, and we had classified them, and we have rewritten all the laws that we had to change. We did this with, here's the interesting part. We did this with a group of 7 people. 4 law students of the Universidad de San Andrés, expert in constitutional law, of a big professor of the Universidad de San Andrés, myself, I was a professor of the Universidad de San Andrés, and my TA, which is today the chainsaw man, at the Universidad de San Andrés. 7 people, budget, zero pesos, okay? So, okay, we started reading the first law, okay? Of course, at some point, you get into laws that you don't know anything about, okay? For example, environmental laws. I don't know nothing about environmental laws. It's not something that I've worked on or anything. Okay, so here's the point. You can't really ask someone to help you who is very much from the ecosystem. Because if you ask help to someone from the ecosystem, they're not going to be revolutionary enough. Because they're already too vested into that. So you can't ask a big lawyer studio to help you. Because, I mean, if you want to get rid of the whole law, the guy says, what am I going to work off? Okay, so this is not going to work. So typically it's independent professionals which kind of shared our ideological view about what had to be done and about the regulation. That was kind of the ideal partner for this. But the conversation was something like this. So I said, okay, environmental law. So I would call, okay, I find who can be the person. So I call this person. I say, Federico, he happened to be Federico. Can you help me with the environmental laws? Yes, sure, I can help you. I'm going to send you a paper where we reviewed and made a diagnosis of all the things that had been done, that have to be done. I said, if you want to send me the paper, I'm not going to read it. I'm not interested in reading the paper. No, but, well, if you want, we can do a meeting and I can explain. No, I don't do meetings. Okay, you want some bullets, maybe more efficient bullets. I don't read bullets. What the hell do you want, okay? And I said, I don't know, what's the problem with the environmental laws? For example, we have a problem with something called the glaciers law. The glaciers law is a law which protects our glaciers, which is not a problem to protect the glaciers, that's perfectly fine. But the problem is that it defines a surrounding area to the glaciers, which is very ill-defined, it's very vaguely defined. And the fact that it's so vaguely defined, it produces a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to whether you can do economic activity in that area which is undefined. Some provinces are fully covered by this surrounding areas, therefore, for example, mining is forbidden in those provinces because of the fact that this thing is so undefined. Okay, so I said, okay, do the following. Get the law down from Infolec, which is our system for finding laws in Argentina, put it in a Word, and read, and tell me what you want to change of this law with track changes, because if not, it's going to be impossible for me. And then I check what you've decided to change, okay? Okay, the point is that when I got to that part of the conversation, 70% of the people I was talking to never appeared again. Okay, for good and for bad reasons. Maybe they were chantas, they didn't know really about the thing. Others, perhaps they were very professionals, but they were willing to give me an hour of their time to share their wisdom, but they were not willing to work for a month free to see how you have to change the Article 3 inciso, I don't know what it's called, inciso I, okay? And you have to be very precise. You have to know what you're doing when you're actually talking. So some people didn't feel, some people kind of were scared. No, how am I going to change a law? I was a member of parliament, okay? So I kind of don't have that kind of problems. And if you see the cooking of the laws, then you know anybody can do it, okay? Anyway, but the important thing is that with the 30% of the people who really delivered, then I said, oh, you did the glaciers law, now do me the water law, now do me the air law, etc., etc., etc. And with that way, by doing that, after 2 years, we had this. 2 piles of papers. The pile on the left were all the laws that we had identified that had to be eliminated, all together. That's ciao, afuera, okay? Ciao, ciao. And the right were the laws that had to be rewritten, and what you have there is the pile of rewritten laws. Actually, I was doing this for a presidential candidate, which was not Javier Milei. Javier Milei knew I was working on this. We have a long relationship, so he said, "Oh, don't worry, to just do it. We'll use it when I'm president." When Javier wins and goes to the ballotage, and the person I was working with had lost to Javier, now she's the Minister of Security of Javier, we immediately decided to take this and to show this to Javier, okay? So we went to see Javier. I put these two piles are in my office, but I put these two piles, and we had a 6-hour meeting where we discussed all the things that were in this project. And I have to confess that he moaned like as if he was having an orgasm, okay? As we went along, okay? So it was fantastic. And this part of this became the executive decree that 10 days into his government, we did a gigantic sweeping reform and deregulation of the economy. And then 10 days later, we sent to Congress something called the Basis Law, and where we also sent a part of this package, okay? The Basis Law is particularly interesting because it also gave us something called delegated powers to change laws, particularly in reference to kind of things that we think that the government should not do. So basically the Congress has given us 1 year to change laws to eliminate useless things that the government has to do, which they have to do by law. We can go and change the law without going to Congress. Today I have 75 days left. Okay, so these last 75 days are going to be quite a scene to be seen. Okay, in terms of that we have a big pipeline of delegated projects which are going to see the light in the next few weeks. Okay, and so anyway, so I would say this project is the backbone. It basically covers the whole legal system. I would say by the end of the year we're gonna be halfway done through this, which is not a small achievement to do in 2 years. Then the second method, so this is the base method, okay? Then as I was mentioning about the watermelons and the fact that we listen and that we did this website and that we've got 12,000 recommendations, so that we read each one of them and we see if it's an opportunity for deregulation. A lot of the things that we do have to do with that. I don't know if you follow me on Twitter every morning, because we have the pipe is so big, the law of large numbers, kind of 1 or 2 things kind of drop per day. So you're gonna see me tweeting 1, 2, 3, eventually none. On some days, deregulation. So I think that is an important part of the communication. And then the last thing is price differences you have to look. So for example, if you have something that is sold in Argentina at the same price as in Europe, we may have a problem or not, but it's not. Now, if I have a Toyota Yaris, which is an entry-level Toyota, costs the same in Argentina than buying a Tesla in the US, I know I have a problem there, okay? Or if, for example, if medicines in Argentina are 5 times more expensive than in Spain, or 25 times more expensive than in India, not 25%, 25x, okay? 25 times, then I know I have a problem there, okay? So price difference is also kind of a guiding light as to where we should put the energy. Now, before giving some examples, I want to, 2 more things. Everybody knows the Lord of the Rings here, correct? When the Lord of the Rings, there's a city called Minas Tirith. Minas Tirith, the feature of Minas Tirith is it has 7 walls, okay? So deregulation sometimes feels like trying to penetrate Minas Tirith. By the way, Minas Tirith, the good guys were in Minas Tirith, okay? But anyway, it doesn't matter. So I'll give you an example. So for example, in Argentina, we had a large company which had lobbied to avoid the export, to prohibit. A lot of things are prohibited. I realized that you can't export anything. Everything is prohibited for being exported from Argentina. Amazing. Unbelievable. These guys had lobbied to make scrap, forbid the export of scrap, because these guys use the scrap to make tubes, okay? So if you forbid the export, the domestic price falls, they get the input cheaper. Okay, so when I opened my email, a lot of, the collateral damage of this was amazing because you have a lot of firms who produce residues that can be recycled. And they are recycled at international markets and international facilities. But no, it was impossible to export, it was forbidden. So for example, the phone companies, they have the cables with copper inside. There's a recycling industry of these cables to recover the copper in China. I can't export because it's forbidden. No one had thought about the cables. It was about the scrap for the tubes, okay? People were not getting the boats out of the river because the scrap was worthless. The mining industry has a lot of residues that you need to get out to be recycled. And people were writing to me saying, firms, medium-sized firms, because one thing that is important to notice is that regulation is pro-corruption and is anti-small firm, because the regulation is okay for the large firm, but for the small firm, it's a killer, okay? So deregulation is pro-entrepreneurship, is pro-small firm, and it's anti-corruption. It's important to keep that in mind. Anyway, so we get rid of that thing, okay? Perfect. 20 days later, the guy writes, it didn't work. The guy writes to me and says, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? No, because you forgot to get rid of Resolution 84 of Customs. What does Resolution 84 say? Well, it says that scrap can only be exported from the port of Buenos Aires. And I'm in Salta, which is 2,000 kilometers. I need to send my thing to Chile to go to China. Okay, so I guess someone had a little bit of a business there in kind of getting the scrap out, whatever. So we get rid of 84. 1 month later, the guy writes to me and says, no, Federico, it didn't work. What do you mean it didn't work? No, it didn't work because you forgot to eliminate Resolution 1001 from year 82. And what does Resolution 1, this is on the mail, correct? What does Resolution 1001 say? It says that I cannot be authorized to export scrap if I do not prove that there's no local producer who's willing to do the recycling before. And there's one guy, which is a monopolist, he charged me, I have no business, this is not done, okay? Okay, so we get rid of 1001 of 82, and 1 month later, so that's the third thing of Minas Tirith, correct? The third wall of Minas Tirith. And 1 month later, they say Federico didn't work because the bureaucrats of the environmental agency are not giving the permits. Well, I'm working on that right now. So, but I think I have the bear a little bit weakened by now. Okay, so I should. But I mean, this is not for the faint-hearted. Okay, and you have to be persevere because in system you have this concept of redundancy. You know, in information systems, the backup of the backup of the backup. Well, these regulations have a lot of redundancy. So you get rid of one, but then it's held up by a different regulation. Anyway, but we've done a lot of things. Let me just give you an example and then finish with one political thought. Ilan mentioned this. We deregulated the rental market. The price of rentals fell by 30% in real terms. There was a prohibition for satellite internet. We freed that. Then suddenly, you know, Argentina is a very sparse country. Very difficult to have a fiber cable reaching everywhere. And you can get it by internet. That was forbidden. We freed, and suddenly all in Argentina, you can have access to internet. The previous government spent $7 billion in a company to throw fiber optic cables, and now it's kind of, it's not that it's worthless, but kind of, okay, so it's different. We have, for example, we have something which is called a yerba mate, probably you know, yerba mate, which is a beverage, a very awful thing that we drink, but we've got used into it, okay? For example, we fixed the price, okay? So we eliminated the fixing of the price with a decrease 70 there, and then also someone called me and said, oh, you think you did something, but you know, we have a prohibition to increase production. So it was forbidden to increase production. The farmers could not plant yerba mate to increase production, okay? Just to keep the price high on the domestic consumer. And it's a very interesting industry because 96% of Argentine families consume yerba mate, and the industry says that their market outside of Argentina is zero. I say, I understand this. I mean, you've been able to convince 96% of Argentine families to consume this product, and you say that you're not going to convince anybody outside of Argentina to consume this product. I mean, it makes no sense to me, okay? You have the whole market out there. Additionally, you have Leo Messi drinking mate, okay? So, I mean, Nike would die to have that kind of advertisement, but anyway. Okay, so with the regulated iron, prices came down 40%. The yerba mate prices came down 40%. Rentals, I mentioned, came down 30%. Kind of 30% would be my ballpark. Deregulated transportation. Anyway, I could go on with examples. I finish with one comment. When you think about deregulation, there's two layers to that deregulation. Two layers. An economic layer and a political layer. So this goes to the sustainability. So let's, for example, I think Argentina, I have the expression that Argentina has been captured in its own Bermuda Triangle. And the guys who are supporting this Bermuda Triangle are the unions, some part of the business community, and the political establishment, okay? These are the guys who have created this system which has captured us inside, in this Bermuda Triangle. And they have managed to keep Argentina there for 50 years. This is a system of the caste that Javier talks about, the caste system, okay? Was instituted in the end of the 60s, legally, by a military government at the end of the 1960s, and nobody could undermine this. And then Javier is the first real challenge to this system in 50 years. And Javier talks about the impoverishing model of the caste, or system of caste, because when this was instituted in the late 60s, which is when I was born, you may not know this, but Argentina was a country which was much richer than Spain. In fact, I was 10 years old, and Argentina still was a country which was richer than Spain. And today, its income level is impossible to compare with that of Spain, okay? And when this system was instituted in the late 60s, the poverty rate in Argentina was 5%. And Javier Milei inherited a poverty rate of more than 50%, okay? So that's why Javier says it's the impoverishing model of the caste, which is sustained by these constituencies, the political establishment, part of the business establishment, and part of the unions. So when you do a reform, there's an economic meaning to the reform. For example, I do a reform which introduces competition. We want competition, correct? The market system is going to work better. We believe in that. That's all fine. But when you introduce competition, you also reduce the rents of those who are sustaining the system. So you're weakening the forces which want to keep you in the Bermuda Triangle. Correct? And so I think it's very interesting to have this two dimension of and me as an economist, I would say that for me, the economic dimension is not the most important. The most important dimension is the financing or the definancing or the weakening of the finances of those who are using those resources to sustain this status quo society. As Asimov Robinson will call this non-economic inclusive institution. So I think there's kind of these two dimensions of the regulation. And I have to say that the president is, I already mentioned it, but I think he has a tremendous conviction that he wants to undo the system. He has tremendous conviction on the need of the fiscal surplus. He has a tremendous belief on freedom at large, not only economic freedom, but freedom at large. And so for all of us, it's a real honor to be able to work with him. And I think thanks to him, we've been quite effective in this first year and a half, and hopefully it will continue to that until the end of his second term. Thank you.
So this was great. We have little time. Actually, I have many questions, but perhaps it would be more useful if someone from the audience wants to ask a question. State your name and affiliation.
I'm Roberto Isurieta, Alternative Director for Ecuador. More than a question, I will add one example that happened to me last week. Last year and a half, I was member of the cabinet. My husband is American. He wanted to be Ecuadorian. So the president knew, he said, that's very proud. You're living together 25 years. He has all the right to become Ecuadorian. I will sign the presidential decree. He will be Ecuadorian. Stupid me, I say, no, I want to go to the process. We are going to do the whole process. It took us a year and a half, and it was very painful. Last week, I finished the process, and the last two steps were, whether they were approved or not. One was an interview, and if anyone is here married more than 10 years, you know that you say A, you answer A in a separate question, and your partner will say C. So you say, we are going to fail miserably, and we were separate, and then we came and said, yes, you passed the test. Oh, thanks God. And now, the last part was I have to prove that I have an income in Ecuador every month. But the process was that I have to give the certificate 4 months notarized. So I did not read them. I was minister then. I didn't have an income. Thanks God, I sold a car, so I have a deposit of $500 every month. So I gave the papers to her, and she was reviewing one by one, and they said, sir, we have a problem. I said, oh, damn, what is the problem? In October, you didn't have an income. He said, well, that's impossible. Check November, because very likely there are 2 deposits in November of 500. He said, no, but the law, the regulation said every month, so you don't pass. So after a year and a half, I look at her, looking at the eye, say, ma'am, I feel that I'm subject of discrimination because this is a gay marriage. Am I right? She looked at me, rubbed this time, and say, approve. So next week you're invited to we are going to go to the process. But it was an example of how ridiculous could it be. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Yes.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you about entitlement reforms like pension and healthcare. You've made some progress there, but what are you thinking?
Well, in Argentina, it's a federal country. So, for example, health and education and security are competencies of the provinces. We've done some change in the health system to generate more competition between the health system, which was provided by the unions, and the private sector, which is something that we regulate. But the provision of health is a provincial competency, and the national government only just coordinates, for example, if you have a pandemic or the vaccination program and things like that. Let me use the opportunity to mention this. Javier is doing a big reduction in the size of the national government. I've been in other governments which have also made a very significant effort to also try to trim down the size of provincial governments. And here, the President Milei has an approach which I think is much more, actually what happened in those other governments is that they didn't get anything done with the provincial governments, and they distracted all their energy, so they didn't get their job done either on the national government. So I think Javier has a very mature approach on this, and he says, look, people have voted us to make the national government work. So you guys are going to focus entirely on the national government, okay? And how we're going to deal with the provincial, we're going to deal with it in the electoral process. So our candidates are going to say in the elections, if you want to vote the status quo, you vote the status quo, no problem. It's a matter of what people decide. What are our candidates going to suggest is we're going to reduce the government expenditure 30%, and if you reduce the government, which Carlos' government has already shown can be done in the national government, and with that we're going to reduce the provincial taxes. I'll give you an example. A lot of provinces in Argentina get a big chunk of their share of income from a sharing scheme with the national government. The government collects the value-added tax and the income tax, both for the provinces and the national government, and then shares the proceeds. So you have provinces that maybe get 90% of their income from this sharing scheme. So if they get 90% of their income from this sharing scheme, this means something very obvious, which is that if they reduce their spending 10%, they could bring all the provincial taxes down to zero. It's kind of a relatively obvious thing. So our candidates are going to be Our candidates are going to be carrying that message. Now, we've reduced I mentioned 50%, about 50% of the public employees, and I think no one is going to say that any significant service provided by the national government has been affected, okay? So what a libertarian governor will do is it's a different thing, because you will have to deal with health, you will have to deal with security, you will have to deal with education. But I think that the amount of fat in the provincial governments probably exceeds very handsomely what we found in the national government. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Do we have a little bit more time, or yes? Let me.
One or two.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much, Federico. It was very interesting. I think many of all that.
Sharing your name and
Alex Contreras, executive director of Peru in IDB board. I was mentioned that many of the examples happen in Argentina, in Ecuador, in Peru, and the reforms that you are doing. I have a question, no? Because what is the next? What will happen? What will happen after Milei? Are you planning some constitutional reform to avoid that these lobbies can generate new laws in the next years? Because this happened in Peru, this happened in Latin America. I think something that provides you this speed in the changes is the delegation of powers of the Congress. But what will happen in the next years? Thank you.
I would say we were talking with Laura before we come in about this. Obviously, one temptation is to do an institutional reform to lock in the things. That has worked. For example, when Colombia or Chile made the central bank independent, it changed things, okay? And certainly that is a possibility. We're kind of on we're not there yet. We're kind of working on all these reforms. We're kind of get the state down to its a more reasonable size. As the economy recovers and the state collapses, there's going to be a reordering of the tax system as well. So I think we're kind of really much focused on that and trying to make things work and to have people support this process of economic freedom and having a state which is smaller. And I think kind of gain long-term sustainability from the support and the success of those reforms. But I want to go back to my last point of the Bermuda Triangles, which is that I think what I think is something different here is that we understand that there are forces which want to bring you back to somewhere else. No? So, for example, the Peronist Party, the unions, if we would be in the French Revolution, those would be the parties of Louis XVI, correct? This would be the defenders of Louis XVI, the Peronist Party. And I mean, Louis XVI had this interest that he had to protect, the landowners and the church, okay? Those were so that's the Peronist Party in Argentina. And so I go back. How did the French Revolution establish itself? Because it changed the economic power of the church and it changed the economic power of the landowners, okay? So when I was mentioning that the reforms have this dimension of definancing the people who want to bring you back, I think that is the biggest guarantee that the system will change, okay? I'm also going to tell you an anecdote. Argentina and Australia more or less had a similar parallel lives during the 20th century. Like the relative income of an Australian and an Argentine was pretty much constant till the early 80s. Maybe you may not know this, or you may think that Argentina had this secular stagnation, but you compare it with Australia, the things depart in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Australians chose as prime minister a guy called Bob Hawke. His finance minister was Paul Keating. They were the Labour Party, so they were more left. They did a pro-market reform. They opened up the economy, very similar to what President Menem did in Argentina in the 1990s. And then Australia took that course. This guys won 4 elections in a row, then the conservative came, but never changed course. And Australia is one of the most beautiful and pleasant countries to live in, whereas Argentina reverted all its reforms in the early 2000s. And I had this thing, why did Australia revert? And so why did Argentina revert and Australia did not revert? And I was once telling this question to the Australian ambassador in Argentina, and he said, oh, I don't know the answer to your question, but I can pay you a ticket to Australia so you can ask the people who were doing this, no? A caballo regalado no se le miran los dientes. Okay, so there I went to Australia, and I ended up interviewing Paul Keating, which was the finance minister of Bob Hawke, 3 terms, and then he was elected prime minister. And I asked him this question. And he said 2 things which I think were very interesting. The first one, he said, when you look at the reform process of Australia from afar, 20 years, 30 years after it happened, you tend to think that we were geniuses, that it was amazing, that it was clockwork precision. We did this reform, and we were amazing. Nothing further from the truth. I got to home every night feeling as if I had been skiing all day with 1 ski. Okay? So the metaphor is clear, correct? In a democracy, when you're trying to push reforms, you're going to fall, you're going to tumble, you're going to fall the precipice, you're going to have to walk up, you have to go back, it's a mess, okay? This is interesting this is perhaps more interesting for an Argentine audience. You see the bumps every day, but if you move in the right direction, in the same direction, all these bumps are going to be invisible in the distance. I thought that was kind of an interesting, for those of us who are in the fight every day, I think it's an interesting comment, something to keep in mind. But then on the question of why Australia had been able to answering your question, to consolidate this, his answer was totally surprising to me. Then after, I'll tell you what it is in a second. Then after a while, I thought that it made sense. And he said, you know why it consolidated? Because people knew we were honest. That was his answer, okay? Like in the sense that for a society to buy into a change, which is difficult, the president always says that when Moses took the people of Israel to Israel, you know, and he had this thing, like 7 plagues, so God had made himself pretty evident, correct? 10 plagues, 10, oh, sorry. So yes, I'm not a very religious person. So anyway, so God had shown himself in the 10 plagues. So Moses, you would say, has a lot of credibility, correct? And only 20% of the people went with Moses. So even having God shown his might and his support for Moses, 80% of people decide to stay as slaves. So what I'm saying is changes are difficult. For people to buy into the change, they have to trust the reason for the change. And the perception of the honesty of the leader is critical. And if you ask myself, I think Javier has that angel. Because everybody knows that he's here, he wants to change, he's in this system that has taken 70% of our kids to poverty in a society that 50 years ago did not have poverty. He wants to change this. And as he has already said, after his 2nd term, he has one, he wants to go back to the countryside with his dogs and retire completely, no? So I think he has this angel, he has this perception, and who knows if at the end of the day, this is what provides the credibility and the empathy and the willingness of Argentines to say in this course. I just share this experience because it's what a leader from another country, which had also gone through this process, shared with me at some point, and I think it's kind of an interesting thing. So,
and I think with that, I think we should end. This has been great. Thank you very much. Thank you for your service and perseverance.